All right. So hello, everyone. Welcome to the UU Virtual Roundtable. My name is Sarah Reyes, and I'll be today's moderator. Just a couple of things before we start. So number one, we will be recording this session and uploading it to the UUCLC YouTube channel. If you want to view this at a later event or day, we will be also posting the link to that on our UUCLC Facebook page. So go visit there if you're interested in looking at that. And we also just post general content as well as updates onto the Facebook page. So that's a good resource to have. Secondly, so we're going to have a discussion about challenges coming up in the NM State Legislature. I cannot pronounce some of these words sometimes. So before that, we're going to just have a quick little presentation, about 30 minutes. So during that time, please hold off on asking any questions because we will have a Q&A session afterwards. And with that said, go ahead, take over, Bill.
Thank you. And I don't know that I'm going to talk for a full 30 minutes. I'll give some overview, but I always tends to work better when I'm answering the questions and issues and concerns and things you've read about and heard about and want to get the real scoop on what's going on up in Santa Fe. The biggest thing everybody is concerned about is how are we going to hold a legislative session come mid-January for 60 days amid COVID. All of the modeling numbers indicate that New Mexico is going to hit its peak of COVID cases right about mid-January when the legislative session would start. And how are we going to manage and do that? And I don't have any answers. The things that are being discussed, there's everything from postponing the legislative session until April or May. I don't think the Constitution allows us to do that. It specifies specifically where we must have it. We might be able to do something like go up there for a day or two, pass some rule changes and things that allow us to do that, and then come back in a special session later on. But there's some logistics and legal things that make that, in my opinion anyhow, unlikely. What's most likely is we're going to hold some sort of a hybrid session. And by a hybrid session, the public will not be able to participate in the Capitol building, in the Roundhouse. They are talking about renting out the Santa Fe Convention Center for the 60 days. The Convention Center has much larger rooms to hold committees in that allow social distancing, would allow a limited amount of the public to be there, and having the committee meetings over there. So when I serve as the chair of the Senate Education Committee, we would have the committee meeting over there, and then in the afternoon would be back over in the Capitol for the floor sessions. But the floor sessions would be closed to the public, lobbyists and such. They always will be webcast, and there'll be a mechanism for some of the public input when places like that are available. But floor sessions, typically there isn't any public input. So, that's how they're talking about doing a hybrid session. There have been some discussions about going in and passing some of the money bills for the economy that have to get done in 2 weeks, adjourn and come back in special sessions later on. Special sessions are limited to no more than 30 days, so you have to do back-to-back ones if we did that. And so many of the bills that we have both have substance to them as well as fiscal ramifications. And so it's hard to just do all the money bills and then come back and do all the bills that are non-money bills, because almost everything has a budget impact at some level or other with it. So I am and others are very nervous about going up there for 60 days, where I'm around a bunch of people from all around the state that have, in my opinion, questionable personal hygiene is not the right thing, but from the east side of the state that don't have the same level of caution and concern that I tend to have and expect. When we had the most recent special session where we went up the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, it was possible. I went up, got parked in the garage. We had to be there because the Constitution says that you must be at the seat of government, which is the Roundhouse in Santa Fe. for legislative sessions. And so when I went up there, I went into my office and I sat in my office for 6 hours watching the Zoom and participating by Zoom, and got back in my car and drove home that evening. And other than seeing one or two people and kind of waving at them in the hall, that's about all the interaction I had with anybody on my trip to Santa Fe and back. I think we're going to have a lot of it be available like that as well, that we, even the floor sessions, may be able to do that from our offices. It is not ideal. It is not effective. It is much worse than ideal, but it's better than nothing. And pandemics like this don't come around all the time. You've got to make some things that happen differently as a result. So we'll see what that looks like. Some of the legislators up there think, oh, pandemic, no big deal. You know, why is everybody making such a big deal about wearing masks? And then there are several of us that are much more concerned about that because of health problems and concerns and other kinds of things. Yet there's also an obligation. I am contacting the governor's office that after we do frontline healthcare workers, legislators and the legislative staff might be one of the next groups that ought to be looking at getting the vaccine, being able to pass the bills to get relief out to people and all the other kinds of things, I think is a really important thing for the people of New Mexico, that after the frontline healthcare workers, we might be the next group. And we're talking about a few hundred people among the legislators and the legislative staff that are necessary to make a legislative session work. I don't know whether that'll come about or not. So just on how we're going to do a legislative session is going to feel very, very different. There won't be all of the hoopla that occurs. There won't be the big joint sessions where the federal delegation comes and talks to us. The governor's state of the state is going to be virtual and by Zoom. There won't be the crowds of people there. There won't be any rallies in the rotunda. There won't be school groups coming through. There won't be crowded elevators and halls with lobbyists. It's essentially just going to be the necessary staff and legislators in the Capitol building. There'll be a bit more interaction over at the convention center, but even that, and they're talking about doing temperature sensing for everybody who goes in. And they're also talking about providing testing for legislators and staff once or twice a week while we're up there. We'll see. The virus really is what's dictating this more than anything. And so they're kind of keeping the options open to see what happens. Everybody's very concerned about spiking numbers, particularly with Thanksgiving, Christmas, the holidays, people traveling, and the spread that's almost certainly going to increase as a result of that. Now, having said that, there's some very interesting things going on in the legislature at this point. 2 years ago, the House had a major shift. If you remember, I think it was 6 years ago, the Republicans took over the House by 2 votes for 2 years. And it was gridlock. Nothing happened at all. First, the Republicans had not been in leadership for years and years and years, and none of them had experience running committees. Their staff didn't know how to run things, and they were very slow in getting some of the things started, and very little happened in the House. The Senate, that at the time had a, let me make sure I get it right, a 26-16 majority, thus became when lots of the legislation that came over that the Democrats were not pleased with, such as abortion bills and right to work bills and death penalty bills and all kinds of things of that sort, it was up to the Senate to stop any of that kind of legislation. The governor almost certainly was going to sign most of that. And so it was a very difficult time in the Senate as we were working through all of that. And many of you may recall that we had a fairly conservative block of senators in the Democrat side as well. Several from here locally and others around the state, but that often sided on those big social bills with the Republicans in the Senate. And so the numbers in the Senate on those big social bills were very, very tight. And we were the the roadblock, the stop to keep some of the bad legislation, in my opinion, from going through. After 2 years, the Democrats retook the House, but they retook it by only about 2 or 3 votes. And they also had some conservative Democrats in the House membership. And so it was still very contentious. Both sides were fighting with each other. I'm so glad I'm in the Senate because they, from the very start, were meeting until midnight every night and then would have committee meetings at 8 o'clock the next morning. There's a rule in the House that bills have a 3-hour time limit for debate. And so every single bill, whether it was the smallest memorial to important legislation, had a 3-hour debate. And so they would start at 6 o'clock in the evening, and first bill be done at 9, the next bill be done at midnight, and sometimes they'd get another one in before it would close. And they'd get 3 or 4 bills a day passed. And that went through almost the entire session. I have no idea how they physically managed that. And we in the Senate, we'd be done with our floor session at 3 or 4 in the afternoon. The evening committees would meet, and everybody'd be home at 7 or 8 or off to the various receptions that are held around by various groups. And it was all senators at those, and the House was all back on the floor. Well, 2 years ago, there was a major takeover, I'm not sure it's quite the right word, but resurgence of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives, almost entirely led by women. For the first time in the history of New Mexico, the Democrats in the House had more women than they had men. And they almost had a majority of women in the entire House of Representatives. It was led primarily by the Albuquerque group and contingent. And in fact, out of all of the legislators in Albuquerque of the House of Representatives, only one Republican survived that wave. And he didn't have an opponent. All of the other Republican House members out of Albuquerque lost. That gave them almost a super majority. Let's see, there's 70 there. And so they were something like 47-23 as their numbers. I mean, it was a huge wave. Well, that caused some interesting things over on the Senate, because on the Senate, if you remember, we still had about 6 very conservative senators, and the House had turned very progressive. And so all kinds of bills were coming over to the Senate with a very progressive agenda. And suddenly, those conservative senators, some who always seemed to vote with the Republicans, and we had a lot of very tight votes. Now we're talking 2 years ago. And so those tight votes were on repealing the outdated abortion bill that, if Roe v. Wade were to change, would criminalize both doctors and women seeking abortions, gun control bills, marijuana bills, all of those came quickly over from the House, and the conservative Democrats made sure that those got steered into their committees where they wouldn't hear them, where they wouldn't get heard at all. Committee chairs have a lot of power in New Mexico to hear bills or to just put it in their pocket and never hear them. And there's really not much anybody can do about it if the committee chair chooses to do so. And by the way, that also included the amendment for tapping into the permanent fund to fund early childhood education, some of the other education kinds of bills. Whole lot of those kind of things essentially got pocket vetoed by some of the conservative Democrats. Democrats were in the majority on the Senate side and got pocket vetoed, never to be heard. The other thing that was almost on the opposite side was a whole lot of bills came over from the House, and I chair Senate Education, and they come into my Education Committee, and I'd look at it like, well, this is a good idea, and I'd start looking through the bill and going, oh my goodness, do you realize it does this and it does this? There was a lot of bad legislation with good intention that came over, that people voted for the idea behind it, but hadn't really read it, vetted it, and thought about what it really might be doing. And so I found myself, as the chair of education, having to go to the sponsors and saying, I'm not going to hear this bill in my committee until you go fix it. And some of them would comment back, it's like, well, can't you fix it in your committee? Well, when I'd been trained by Michael Sanchez, who had been in the Senate for a long time, he assigned me to him as my mentor. And one of the things that he would tell me was, don't fix bad bills, kill them. It's not your job to fix a bad bill. That's the sponsor's job. If it's a bad bill, kill it. So here I am with some bills that are really good ideas, but they're badly written. What do I do? Do I kill it? And so what I started doing was I'd make a couple of notes. I'd call the sponsor in before it would come to my committee, before I'd schedule it, and say, you might want to go fix this, because as it is now, it's not going to pass my committee. And several of them were unhappy. It's like, well, it passed unanimously out of the House committee. All the Democrats voted for it. Well, because it was a good idea. Nobody actually read the legislation. And so started working more with the sponsors about fix the bill before it gets over here. So almost the opposite is both, before we had to fight bad ideas that were coming over. Now we had to fight good ideas that were badly written and make sure that they didn't become law. And so, some people, they would blame, oh, that Senate, it never hears any of our bills. It won't let anything pass. It's like, well, for both sides, some of you don't want bad bills, as well as you don't want good bills that are just badly written. Neither one should become law. No. So fast forward now to the election that just occurred. And most of it started back in the primary, in that all except one of the conservative Democrat senators got beat in the primary. The only one who didn't have a primary opponent was Senator George Munoz out of the Gallup area. But Senator Smith, who very conservative Democrat out of Deming, very powerful, chaired the finance committee, so held up lots of the finance bills, very much a supporter of oil and gas and drill baby drill type of things, got beat in the primary. Mary Kay Papin got beat in the primary. Clemente Sanchez got beat in the primary. John Sapien didn't run again because he would have gotten beat in the primary. Trying to remember, there's one or two other ones. But all of the conservative Democrats got beat. Richard Martinez up out of Rio Arriba County got beat in the primary. And so we knew there was going to be a major shift in the Senate, even if we didn't increase the numbers at all, that the actual shift was going to move much more progressive in the upcoming legislature. And that's exactly what happened. We have 7 new senators on the Democrat side. There are, I think, two new senators on the Republican side. The Democrats in the Senate increased our majority. It is now 27-15, where it had been 26-16. But it's much bigger change than that, because in the past, we always had to worry about, on more progressive types issues, social issues, about 4 or 5 of the Democrats siding with the Republicans to stop the progressive issues. We don't have that now. All 7 of the new people coming in are bright, they are sharp, they are dedicated, and it's people locally like Carrie Hamblin who got elected. Saya Correa Hempel out of Silver City area, who is a PhD school psychologist. There's a couple of women up from northern New Mexico, Harold Pope, who's retired, I think he's Navy, and is the first Black senator ever elected in the state of New Mexico. Very, very good, and they are smart, they are dedicated, and as a group, they came in and said, we were elected to make changes. And they already have formed a caucus with each other and interviewed people who were running for the Senate Pro Tem position and said, we're expecting to have bills on the legalization of adult use cannabis. We expect that to be heard. We expect gun control bills to be heard. We expect it to be heard, the tapping into the permanent fund for early childhood education, the repeal of the abortion bill that got stuck the last couple of times. We expect those to be heard. That is who we, that is one of our things. Tell us why we should vote for you for Senate Pro Tem. I mean, I'm like, woo, you go. And so that's exactly what's happening now. Sitting in the Democratic caucus meetings, what a different feel it is in that people really are starting to talk about, we have an opportunity to really make some social movement and changes where things have been stymied either because of a Republican governor or conservative Democrats in the Senate, the House being under Republican control for a little while. Every once in a while, they talk about this being this crack in history when it's time to move things through. And it feels like that's going to be the case this time, except for COVID, which is going to make things very, very different as to how those bills are going to move and move through in a more virtual type of a setting. That's kind of the lay of the land as to what's coming up with the legislature. The two new, on the Republican side in the Senate, their caucus threw out Stuart Ingle, who had been their the minority floor leader for the last 20 years or so, and put in new senators who have always been much more in for a fight rather than in for cooperating than in the past. The two new ones coming in, David Gallegos out of Eunice, is very conservative and a bit of a firebrand. And the other one is Greg Schmiedes out of the East Mountains area of Albuquerque. He's a medical doctor, but he's been one who has regularly been putting out things that the virus isn't worse than the flu, and we need to get to herd immunity, and just some really negative. And I'm like, this is a medical doctor saying this? Oh, one of our new people is Dr. Hickey, who is a medical doctor, and he is smart and bright and sharp, and he's just going to put Schmiedes in his place. We just kind of can't wait for some of those discussions on medical bills. The things that are still up in the air is who's going to be in which committee positions. Senator Mimi Stewart, who is a senator out of the Albuquerque area. She had a long career, 18, 20 years or something in the House of Representatives, has now been in the Senate for 6 years, but she was elected as the Senate Pro Tem. She is a teacher, a retired teacher, also very big environmentalist, and the Senate Pro Tem is the one that makes the committee appointments. However, the Senate Pro Tem is elected by the entire Senate, not just the Democrats. However, we've got a big enough majority, and we don't have the conservative Democrats who often formed a coalition with the Republicans, that I suspect she is going to win the Senate Pro Tem based only on the Democratic votes and won't need any votes from the Republicans in order to maintain that. The biggest decisions that are going to come for her is, first, who's going to chair the very powerful Senate Finance Committee? Are they going to put in somebody who's going to continue the very austerity, conservative ways of Senator Smith, or someone who's going to be much more progressive? It's probably the biggest one where there's people fighting for who's going to get that chairmanship. I've heard rumors that some of the Democratic senators have even said things, that they were contingenting their vote for who was going to be Senate Pro Tem on whether they would get appointed to that position or not. But that will be very interesting. And then where the other committee chairs are going to fall, particularly the Corporations Committee is open. Linda Lopez was elected by our caucus as our whip. So that means the Rules Committee, which hears all of the appointments by the governor, is going to be open. And Indian Affairs is going to be open. There's going to be some movement of different committee chairs, and then also who's going to be the vice chair of each of those committees as well. And so
Yeah,
there's still some of the.
in the last session, none of the southern New Mexico senators or representatives chaired committees. They were vice chairs. But do you think maybe we might get some of our people in those leadership positions?
Oh, we absolutely had committee chairs. I chaired education.
Well, you were, yeah.
Joseph Cervantes chaired for a while. He chaired conservation, and then he was chairing the very powerful judiciary. And so there was work, and Smith chaired finance committee. So absolutely there was.
In the Senate. What about in the House?
I'm not as aware in the House. The House, not so much. Doreen Gallegos is the minority whip. And then they've got some vice chair positions. The House had a much younger group of people coming in. And so there wasn't, particularly from down in the South, there wasn't the tenure for committee chairs that there were from people more further north. The House also, committee chairs are appointed directly by the Speaker. And you know that there tends to be a bit more politics that goes into a lot of that. So this might be a good place to stop, or you know, I could also tell you some of the legislation that I'm looking at, or just if you want to hear that, somebody asked that as a question, I'd be happy.
Why don't you just what's your legislative, priorities?
Well, I am always, education is who I am. And so always it's making sure funding for education. With the special session at the start of COVID, we had to pull back the teacher salaries that we had talked about giving teachers. We want to look at continuing to do that. The budget for the upcoming session back in March or April looked like we might have been as much as $1.5 billion underwater. And by midsummer, it looked like it was 750 million. And then a month ago, it looked like it was 300 or 400 million that we were under. And the current numbers indicate that it's probably looking like it's going to be about flat with last year, or might even be a slight increase. And so if that trend continues, I'll be working very hard on trying to get some of those extra revenues back into education and as an investment in our future. That budget also, and it was set by the conservative Democrats who were still there through all of the finance committee meetings over the summer, and they are no longer there and won't be there. But that also has a 30 to 35% cash reserve. Now, in a $7 billion budget, that's $2 billion of cash reserve that is not working for New Mexico. It's just sitting there because, oh, this COVID's really scary. What if it goes down again? I'm a bit more that, well, what that means is we should be making that investment in the people of New Mexico so that we don't have a big downturn. Don't hide it in the mattress, invest it to keep from having the big economic downturns. And so when I talk about it's flat, that's with somewhere around $2 billion sitting in cash reserves. And so the budget is not in bad shape. So you'll hear people talking about, oh, oil and gas hasn't come back. We've got to be really, really careful. We're sitting on 30% cash reserves. Most economics groups indicate that somewhere around 10% is typically normal. And when there are some headwinds coming, moving it up towards 15 to 18% is prudent. Nobody is recommending that you should have 30% in cash reserves. So that's where that new finance chair, new Senate Pro Tem is going to come in. So education is one where I'm always looking at things. I also do lots in the area of conservation, moving towards more renewable energy. In particular, and this kind of melds in with the education, is I'll be carrying legislation that all new schools being built must have solar capacity to match the size of the school. Also that they must have electric vehicle charging stations. When you put that all in on the front end, it hardly causes any increase in cost as opposed to retrofitting. I will also be carrying a bill that all new construction in New Mexico, new home construction, must be wired for solar and wired for electric vehicles as part of the new construction code. Companion with that, it's a bit more difficult, is to require all new homes to have solar panels installed. That one's going to be a bigger lift because a lot of people don't like or want those. But that would be on top of, well, if you don't put them, you at least have to have it wired and such. And you get a variance if you lived up in the mountains where there's trees everywhere, or you're on the wrong side of the hill or something like that.
I'm watching a lot of new construction, Bill, and there's no solar being put in. I don't know about the wiring. The wiring may be receptive,
Well,
but the roofs are not. The roofs are aimed north and south. I mean, east and west instead of north and south, so that you can't get good solar. You need to face south.
And that's the.
By the way, happy birthday, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you. But that's the concern that we've got right now is homes are being built in the second sunniest state in the country with no thought about reducing the energy demand of the home, with no thought towards that. And so this would be one that would update the construction industry and the building code so that would have to be there. There's also one that would require the state to adopt the latest energy efficiency standards as they come out, which again, just is building on that is we've got the capacity. Let's start taking advantage of all of those kinds of things. I'm going to be carrying a bill that says that the utilities cannot put in any more fossil fuel generation.
Very good.
Kind of short and simple. You can't build a gas plant. I understand that as we transition that we're still going to have some natural gas to fill in the times when the sun's not shining, the wind's not blowing. People talk about that, but we don't need to build a new gas plant. We can keep the old ones there for the 20 hours a year that they're going to need to run. And it may be more expensive than putting in a fancy new high efficiency gas plant. We're only going to run it a few hours a year. You don't need to put in billions of dollars of infrastructure for something you're only going to use every now and then. And so
go ahead, Jane, you had a question. Jane?
Yeah, relative to what you're talking about, Bill, I've been following the ongoing saga with the PRC about whether to approve the 228 megawatt frac gas generator called the Newman Unit 6, which would be over near Chaparral, but on the Texas side. Texas has already approved it. Will the legislature have any way to impact that decision?
Good question.
I don't know the details, Jane. New Mexico has passed that the electricity in New Mexico has to be 100% green, clean by 2040. That means you can't be importing stuff just from the other side of the line because it's not in New Mexico. That's still dirty energy. And so El Paso Electric is going to have enough capacity of non-fossil fuel energy to meet those escalating requirements towards that 2040 goal. They don't like doing that. And here's kind of the simple way of looking at it from the El Paso Electric viewpoint. Publicly owned utilities like that, or private, or the investor-owned utilities, all of their profit, all the profit comes from their guaranteed return on undepreciated assets.
Right.
Okay. So
that's the way
whenever
it's set
you
up.
take them to court and they've got to bring in all their lawyers to defend them, it's like, well, we made them pay for all those lawyers. No, that's all a pass-through cost to us. Okay.
Yeah.
It didn't cost them a nickel to their investors, not a penny. All of their profit comes from undepreciated assets. That's why they want to build brand new spanking beautiful gas generating plants, because that $1 billion investment, they now get to claim a 9% return on investment for the next 30 years.
Yeah.
When you put in a lot of solar, solar doesn't have nearly the upfront investment, and it doesn't have the continued investments for retrofitting and parts and other things, because once it's there, the sun just kind of does it. And so they drag their feet because they don't make a lot of profit off of it. They drag their feet on not wanting to support you putting solar on your house because you own the asset, they don't. And they make no profit off of that. Everything's just a pass-through cost for them with no profit motive. So all of the profit comes from the undepreciated asset. That's why they want to keep building big central generating plants, because that's where they make money for their shareholders.
So
So
how do we change that profit model?
there are some states that are starting to do that. And New Mexico has started some of that by going through and allowing competitive bids for building generation, for doing landscape scale solar, where we're talking about covering square miles with solar panels, and having an open bid process for that, of which, like El Paso Electric can bid, but the low bid comes through. And if El Paso Electric can bid the lowest cost of anybody, they get to claim that as their undepreciated assets for profit. But if not, then another company would get that same benefit, and El Paso Electric would then become more of a distribution company. Across the country, that model is now what's happening. We are moving away from this big, large central utility, which was important when we were doing big gas plants and coal-fired plants. You can't do a distributed model, but solar and wind work beautifully in distributed generation kinds of models, where the big utility doesn't own all of the generation. They become more of a pass-through, and you'll get a fee on your bill for the generate the lines and the distribution and all of that. We all recognize that. That's fine, but not the big asset of the generating facility.
David Skills? Go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, David.
You're still muted, David. There you go.
Okay, sorry. A quick comment and then a question. The comment is Senator Souls, I want to thank you for all of your contributions over the years toward the conservation of our state's natural resources, and for your advocacy for animal welfare legislation. So thank you for that. And my question is what kind of contingency planning is going on, if any, in the event that our governor ends up being tapped for a cabinet position in Washington?
That's a very good question. You may have heard some of the news recently this last week. Apparently, what I heard, and it's been reported some, is she was offered the Interior Secretary position and turned it down. The rumors are that that was sort of a loyalty test. Now, I hate that kind of politics, that they offered her that to see whether she would do whatever she's called upon, and then we're probably going to give her the Health and Human Services later on. But she really wants to be Health and Human Services, not Interior, so she turned them down. So they may be going, not so sure about you anymore, and pulled off. So I think the likelihood of her getting pulled in as a cabinet secretary has diminished as of the last week. I don't know what. What's that?
I think that would be good for us. It's good to have her as our governor.
I think she's been doing a great job, and particularly with the pandemic, and her background in public health has been hugely helpful.
Yeah.
And it's very irritating to the other side. But if she were to get pulled into Washington, the lieutenant governor is Howie Morales. And I don't know how well you all know Howie Morales, but he has a PhD in education. He is a solid Democrat with strong values, progressive values, environmental credibility. I mean, he's a fine man, and I think he would do wonderfully as our governor if that's what happens. The speculation then becomes who would be the lieutenant governor, and how. And I think he would appoint that for until the end of the term, and then they would rerun. Some people have speculated if these are 3 or 4 ifs down the line, but if that were to happen, that possibly someone like Maggie Toulouse Oliver might get tapped as being the lieutenant governor, which then leaves the Secretary of State open, and and on the dominoes go until the music stops and see where every seat everyone's in to mix up a whole bunch of metaphors.
Bill, this is Elisa. I want to ask you some questions about a couple of things. The permanent fund is supposed to be for emergencies, and I would think that right now we're having one emergency, the COVID, but I want to tie that to the Martinez-Yazzie lawsuit. as a product of the New Mexico school system, I need to tell you that I am sick and tired of waiting for multicultural and multilingual education. I would like to see myself and people who look like me represented in the curriculum of the schools. I mean, we are 53% of the school population and we don't exist. People will say, well, what does that mean? Well, look at the curriculum. Are there stories about Mexicans and Mexican Americans, about Native Americans, about Blacks, Asians? We don't exist. I'm tired of it. I'm sorry. And now we're talking about putting money into early childhood education. So you put all these little 3 and 4-year-olds into a white educational system. Let's start them off early. I mean, that's ridiculous. If we're going to talk about early childhood education, let's have multicultural, multilingual education that starts at the pre-K level. And when is that going to happen? And when am I going to hear you say multicultural, multilingual is an asset in New Mexico? Gracias.
I say that many times. I don't know that you've ever heard it, but I absolutely talk about it on a regular basis. And I appreciate all your advocacy for that. And when we talk about early childhood education, we're actually talking about prenatal. We're talking about promotoras going out to work with young mothers before the baby is born to actually do home visiting. And those have to be people that are from the community that are trained on how to assist and help and promote culture all the way through and that is culturally relevant. And so when we talk about early childhood education, we're not talking just about 3 and 4-year-olds. We really are talking about backing all the way up to prenatally to make sure that all of our kids have the opportunities that they come in with. All of the cycle of things for changing education always lag at least a year behind. And so the budget that we're in now was the monies didn't get allocated until a year ago. And so we got stuck with COVID. We put lots of money into the curriculum for bilingual, for multicultural, the public ed department, and we've only had 2 years now of this new governor, not quite 2 years even, of having a new administration and a new head that actually is taking any of that seriously. And they have revitalized the Indian Education Act, the Hispanic Education Act. They've got secretaries that are working on developing curriculum and working on all of those areas. I know the teacher preparation programs, that there is a movement towards increasing the amount of preparation, because in order to teach that, we've got to have teachers that are prepared for doing all of that. That all takes a while. And I understand the frustration of waiting and seeing it not happen. But what we do in the legislature lags a year behind, and then it takes a year to get things. But it is there, it is coming. And then COVID threw a big wrench in it. I mean, we put a lot more money into teacher preparation programs, into the at-risk factor. And when we went back into special session, we had to back up on a whole bunch of that because of COVID. And then currently, what we're doing in education right now is not good education. Nobody is saying that the distance education that we are currently providing is effective and good education. It's not. But it's
I've seen some reports in the paper recently that indicates a student was talking about it, and he said, I'm getting way behind. And he says, my fellow students, the same thing.
Well, I always try and I kind of turn that a little bit when people say they're getting behind what?
Well,
there isn't any ahead or behind. We determine what that is. And I try and encourage people that, our kids, they are growing, they're maturing, they're developing, and they are learning how to survive a pandemic for the rest of their lives. This is going to be a seminal year for them to talk about how they managed to get through all of these things. And we in education are anxious for the time when we can get kids back in school in person when it's safe.
David, you had a comment.
David?
David, you're muted.
Oh, you're muted.
David, I think you're muted. We don't have your.
I didn't have my hand up.
Oh no, it was David Rice.
A different David, the other David.
Yeah, David
Sorry,
Rice.
sorry, David Steele. My question is the criminalization of abortion. Is it as simple as simply repealing an old law, or are those who want to make that more complicated by imposing new restrictions on abortion?
The bill that we're talking about is pretty much just repealing that old law so it's no longer on the books. The anti-abortion groups are trying to make it much bigger than all of that, that this is a pro-abortion bill, that this expands abortions later in pregnancy.
Yeah.
It doesn't do any of those things. All it does is, if at the federal level Roe v. Wade were to be overturned, there would not be a bill that criminalizes abortions in the state. If Roe v. Wade at the federal level is overturned, then all abortion legislation goes back to whatever is in the state. And this criminalization bill would be the law of New Mexico at that point. So it's pretty much just repealing that old law. But the anti-abortion people are making it much bigger than reality, and trying to play on the emotions that this really is about, to use their term, late term abortions and all of that, when that's not the case.
Okay, thank you.
I want to ask a question, Bill, in regard to these terrible lenders that we have, and we have more than we need here in Las Cruces. And I know you've been an advocate of changing that. With the new legislature, is there any chance that that could occur?
I hope so, because I'm carrying the bill. And yes, I think there's a very good chance, and particularly because of the change in the legislature, that there's a very good chance of getting that. A couple of years ago, we got restrictions on, and it pains me to say this, is in New Mexico, we got it lowered from no cap to a cap of 175% interest, and that was progress. Oh my gosh, how is that progress? I tell people it is the hardest vote I ever had to take in the Senate.
Wow.
In that the average prior to that in the state was people were getting charged 350%, with occasionally there were stories of people who were being charged up towards 1,000% interest for the short-term payday loans.
Yeah.
And so there were all kinds of compromises made to lower it to a maximum with a cap of 175% annual interest rate. And when it came down and it came over to the Senate, and because of our conservative senators, it was really up in the air as to whether it was going to pass or not. And I realized it could have come down to my vote. And and so I kind of made a very impassioned plea on the Senate floor of, I cannot support 175% interest. I'm going to vote against this bill. Please support it, because 175% is way better than what we've got. But I would not have been able to sleep at night if I had voted for 175% interest. And it did pass. The bill that we're bringing this time, and it's passed in many other states, and it's relatively straightforward, is the maximum interest rate that can be charged in New Mexico would be at 36%. Now, 36%, I get criticism. People are like, oh my God, 36%. Are you crazy? I couldn't imagine taking out a loan at 36%. But that seems to be the point that most people have hit upon, that allows people that don't have good banking credit and other things, where the lenders feel that they can cover losses for people with bad credit without being so terrible usury laws that it puts them into a deeper trap.
Yeah.
And so if we could pass that, I think we would be in line with where most other states are. And currently, when they're charging 175%, almost all of that money is being sucked right out of the state of New Mexico. They are out-of-state companies that are taking that out of the state of New Mexico from our most vulnerable people who can least afford to be doing that.
Just a follow-up question. What are you aware of the public bank that some people are promoting? And
yes, I'm a big proponent of it. I'm not a financial and banker expert, but I would love to see there be a New Mexico bank, state bank,
Like in North
that
Dakota.
we would seed with some of the money from the permanent fund, like put maybe the $20 billion in the permanent fund, we put $5 billion to seed the state bank, and then lend ourselves money for big projects
Right.
like landscape scale solar, and then pay us back with the revenue proceeds from selling the electrons as a
Right.
public utility.
I'm on a committee that is promoting that, and so I was just wondering how, having been a part member of the World Bank.
Yeah, no, I'm a big supporter of it, but again, I'm by no means an expert on how do you set up
Okay.
a bank or any of the details for how you get started doing that.
Anybody else got a question, comment?
I have a question.
Go
I have a
ahead.
question.
You guys are wonderful. I love classes where people are asking
Hey,
questions.
isn't
all
this
the
great,
time.
Bill?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Rosemary.
Bill, give us your feedback on whether or not you're supporting the Health Security Act. Why or why not?
I do, and since I've been in the legislature, I have supported the Health Security Act. I know there's some controversy that even if we do this, it's going to be 10 to 12 years before it would happen. And so if there's a mechanism to get us something similar faster, I'm all for that as well. But, I've been in the legislature now for 8 years and we talked about it. If we'd actually started 8 years ago, we'd be only 2 or 3 years away from actually getting it done. So we need to get started on it. They're looking at doing the studies now and how much money it's going to save. And, if something better comes along prior to that, I'll switch my vote over to something better that comes along quicker. But otherwise, we need to get started and make sure that all people have access to healthcare.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
Go ahead, Jane.
This is a quick question, Bill, I think. With the legislature being so restricted because of the COVID and keeping just down to the essential key senators and representatives who need to be there to do the work, how will people who do advocacy work, how will their voice be enabled to be heard?
Good question.
That's going to be one of the real challenges. And some of it through things of this sort. I encourage people to know personally their legislators and the legislators from their community and have their email, their phone numbers, etc., so that you can contact them. The committees will all be webcast. I don't know, they're working on some of the details and the rules as to people giving public input for each bill, whether they will read the text messages of public input, all of those types of things. But the advocacy really needs to start now if there are particular pieces of bills and legislation. Starting January 5th is when legislators are able to pre-file legislation. So you'll be able to look up then under topics or by legislator and could start making emails and phone calls.
Okay.
I know there's some discussion that because of this, that our emails and phones are going to blow up a whole lot more than before. And so they're looking at, and I know we're talking about getting like a burner phone for our personal use or something that we restrict the access to, so that we can make a text message to one of the other legislators about a meeting coming up right now without it going through the 40 text messages that we're getting an hour of people advocating for bills. Don't know exactly how all that's going to be working. By the way, and if you all don't have mine, it's fairly common, but we have a chat function on this. I can put it in the chat. Let me see if I can find the chat here, but I'll put both my phone number and my email in the chat, and you're welcome to contact me that way. And I didn't bring my keyboard, so I'm gonna have to do this. But
It's I know the email because I worked hard at getting it. A bill 24 at Gmail.
Yeah, BillSouls24@gmail. I'm having trouble getting the. Oh, there my keyboard came up. So let me see if I can send that. I'm gonna look a little funky because I have to move my computer here to put that in.
Anyway.
Go ahead if somebody else has a question.
Anybody else got a question or comment? Yeah, go ahead, David.
One of the, in a League of Women Voters session yesterday, one of the legislators mentioned the concept of paying New Mexico legislature people Is there any study on that subject going on, Bill?
I don't know that there's any study going on. Let me set this back up and see if I can get that to balance. I don't know if there's any study going on as such. It has been discussed for a while. I think it was stopped by some of that same group of conservative senators and others.
Mhm.
There's always discussion about people wonder whether it's politically expedient, whether they're going to lose their next race if they vote for a pay increase.
Yeah.
I
Any pay.
would be of the opinion that we pass it, but it doesn't go into effect until the new legislators come on. And so House members, if we pass it now in 2 years, the ones that get elected could get paid, and for senators in 4 years. That way we're not voting on, I'm not ever going to be voting on my pay increase.
Yeah.
I'm voting on the pay increase of the next senator that comes in. And that might be me, but I'd have to get reelected before I would be able to get paid.
Aren't we the only state in the union that doesn't pay their legislators?
We are the only unpaid legislature. I think it's New Hampshire gets paid something like $250 a year. So theirs is a token.
Yeah.
But we are the only one that is completely unpaid. Now, don't feel all that sorry for us. We do get paid per diem.
Yeah.
And we do get paid travel money. So it's not like we're completely out of pocket, but it makes it very difficult for somebody who is a working mother, for instance, to be a legislator because they can't take time off from work for 2 months to go up and be in the legislature. We also don't have staff in between. And, there's a whole lot of other things where it tends to give you a less than professional legislature.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Elena had her hand up.
I
Oh,
did.
yeah, go
Well,
ahead,
I had some questions in the chat about, are they doing temperature checks now for those entering the building when you go into the building, Bill?
They aren't. The building is closed to the public.
Right.
When we had the first special session back in, was it April, May, or whenever, or June, we were all supposed to wear masks, and there were several of the Republicans that never wore their masks and others that wore them kind of occasionally, including some of the conservative Democrats that kind of were in denial about it. We are planning on passing rules the first day or two through the Rules Committee. And again, there are enough of the Democratic senators to do so. That would put it as part of the required dress code that on the Senate floor and in all committees, you must wear a mask. And if you don't, then the Sergeant of Arms can remove you because everybody must follow the rules. Where during the special, it was just kind of a please do, and some absolutely refused to do so.
Wow.
There is not currently, but I know as they're looking at running the whole session about the potential for doing daily temperature checks, having weekly, once or twice weekly testing of everybody. Now, I don't think they can require that of legislators. You can't make laws that legislators have to follow that are not then within. Now, we could possibly pass our internal rules that require that.
Right.
But
Right.
we really are elected by the public, and only the public can unelect us.
And then one other question, are there any thoughts of solar installation rebates for the general public?
There almost certainly will be some bills of that sort. I know in the past when they expired a year or two ago, there was discussion about reinstalling some of those rec certificates and things of that sort. I know Mimi Stewart has carried some of those. I don't know if any of those are specifically in the hopper at this point.
Thank you.
Yeah, my 6th year is up this coming January from the state.
Yeah, a lot of people, and the utility companies are thrilled to not be paying those anymore.
Oh, I know.
And they hope it slows down the whole solar market in the state of New Mexico because, again, they don't own the asset. They don't make any profit.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's getting towards, I see Sarah there moving around. And anyway, let's give Bill a big hand.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Bill.
You all are
This has
always
been
seem to be
excellent.
very engaged.